So I lived there most of my life, and when I was 16, my parents split up, and my mom and I moved to Indianapolis.
For years, Steve Ross, the enigmatic figure in the world of business and luxury real estate, has lived under the shadow of his famous father, one of the most influential and controversial figures in modern American history. But now, at 58 years old, Steve Ross has finally broken his silence and revealed the shocking truths about his father that no one ever saw coming.
Before Dad died, he had said, "You must continue." That was his last words, to me.
His long-awaited confession has sent ripples through both the business world and the public, offering a glimpse into a deeply personal story that has remained hidden for decades. What did Steve Ross say about his father that has stunned everyone? The truth will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Steve Ross reveals his father's dark legacy. Steve Ross had always kept his personal life closely guarded, especially when it came to his father, whose legacy loomed large over his own accomplishments. For decades, the world had only seen Steve through the lens of his success, a billionaire businessman with a fortune that spanned real estate, sports, and entertainment. But behind that public image was a man haunted by his father's influence, a father whose actions and choices cast a long shadow over Steve's life. In a revealing interview, Steve opened up about the difficult and often tumultuous relationship he had with his father. "People have always assumed that my father's success was something I inherited," Steve said, his voice filled with emotion. "But the truth is, my father's legacy is something I've always struggled with. It wasn't just about following in his footsteps. It was about surviving in the wake of his choices." For years, Steve had been known as the son of one of the most powerful men in America, but the reality was far more complicated than the public knew. Steve's father, a larger-than-life figure whose name was synonymous with power and influence, had built an empire that was both admired and reviled. "He wasn't the man people thought he was," Steve confessed. "There were things about him that I could never reconcile with, and that's something I've had to come to terms with." The shock of Steve's admission left many questioning what he meant by that. What was it about his father's legacy that Steve had never fully accepted? And why had he kept these secrets hidden for so long? As Steve went on, he described the emotional toll that his father's actions had taken on their relationship. "I wasn't just trying to live up to my father's expectations. I was trying to escape his shadow," Steve explained. "Growing up, I didn't know who I was supposed to be. Everyone around me saw me as my father's son, but I wasn't him. I couldn't be." For Steve, the pressure to live up to his father's monumental reputation was overwhelming, and it caused a rift that lasted for decades. Steve's story about his father is a far cry from the public narrative. While the world may have seen his father as a visionary, Steve had a different perspective, one that was shaped by years of inner conflict and resentment. "People loved him, they admired him, they wanted to be like him," Steve said, his voice cracking. "But they didn't know the other side of him, the side that was ruthless, manipulative, and sometimes just plain cold." This revelation paints a completely different picture of the man who had been idolized for so long, and it begs the question, how much of Steve's own success was shaped by the darkness of his father's legacy? How Steve Ross fought to escape his father's shadow. For years, Steve Ross had been viewed as a successful businessman in his own right, but deep down, he was always battling the identity of being the son of, rather than simply Steve Ross. The weight of his father's shadow was something that followed him everywhere, through his early business ventures, his personal relationships, and even his public image. The constant comparisons to his father, a man whose larger-than-life persona dominated every room, made Steve feel like he was never able to stand on his own. In a candid moment, Steve opened up about the psychological toll that this identity struggle had on him. "It wasn't just that people thought of me as my father's son, it was that I started to think of myself that way too," Steve confessed. "Every achievement, every success, felt like it wasn't mine. It was like I was always trying to prove I wasn't just a reflection of him, and that became exhausting." Despite his own wealth and success, Steve admits that he spent much of his early life struggling to carve out a space for himself outside of his father's towering influence. The desire to escape his father's shadow reached its peak during the early years of his career. "I wanted to build something that was my own, but every time I tried, it felt like the past was dragging me back," Steve shared. "I was always being compared to my father, and I wasn't sure if I could ever do enough to be seen for who I really was." This struggle for individuality became the driving force behind Steve's work. Everything he did was aimed at distancing himself from his father's legacy. "I took risks I wouldn't have taken otherwise. I built businesses in areas my father had never touched. I wanted to prove that I could succeed without following his blueprint. But the pressure to prove himself wasn't just external, it was internal as well. Steve confessed that for a long time, he resented his father for the weight of his legacy. I hated that I was always seen as an extension of him, like I was a lesser version of his greatness, Steve said, the anger still evident in his voice. There were moments when I questioned whether I would ever be able to step out from under that. The comparisons were relentless, and it made me doubt myself. Over time, however, Steve began to understand that in order to truly escape his father's shadow, he needed to come to terms with his legacy, rather than constantly fight against it. The more I tried to reject him, the more I was letting him control me, Steve admitted. I realized I couldn't change who he was or what he did, but I could choose how I responded to it. That's when I started to find peace. This shift in mindset became the turning point in Steve's life. Instead of seeing his father's legacy as something to overcome, he began to see it as part of his own story, something that he could use to define his own path forward. The struggle for identity, however, didn't end with this realization. Steve's journey of self-discovery was far from over, but acknowledging the influence of his father without letting it control him was the first step in building a legacy of his own. I had to learn that it wasn't about being better than my father. It was about being the best version of myself, Steve reflected. Once I accepted that, everything changed. The real cost of the Ross Empire. As Steve Ross delves deeper into his father's legacy, he begins to peel back the layers of a man who, despite his public success, was burdened by demons that the world never saw. Steve's revelations are not just about the financial empire his father built, they're about the toll it took on those closest to him. His father's rise to power was marked by not just ambition and brilliance, but by a darker side that Steve had long struggled to understand. And now, after decades of silence, Steve opens up about the emotional and psychological cost of living in a household ruled by a man whose success came at a great personal price. My father wasn't just a business mogul. He was a man constantly fighting his own demons, Steve explained, his voice laden with emotion. People only saw the empire, the wealth, the power, but they never saw the toll it took on him, and on us. Steve's father, despite being a larger-than-life figure in the public eye, was someone who had internal struggles that often went unnoticed. He had a temper, a darkness inside him that he couldn't escape, Steve continued. And it wasn't just about the work, it was about his personal life, his relationships, his inability to trust anyone, including his family. Growing up under the roof of such a complex figure left Steve with mixed emotions. While he admired his father's accomplishments, he also struggled with the consequences of his father's emotional unavailability. It was like we were living in two worlds, Steve said. On one hand, my father was this powerful figure who was admired by everyone. On the other hand, he was a man who had a hard time connecting with those closest to him. We were always walking on eggshells around him, never knowing what would set him off. The emotional cost of living in such an environment was staggering. Steve reflects on the moments when his father's anger and bitterness would spill over, affecting the entire family. There were times when I couldn't even talk to him. It wasn't because we didn't want to. It was because we didn't know how, Steve admitted. My father's success and his insecurities were in constant conflict. He was a man who had everything but was still trapped in his own mind. It wasn't easy for anyone, least of all for him. Steve's revelations paint a picture of a man who, despite all of his wealth and influence, was haunted by internal struggles that made him unpredictable and often difficult to be around. My father's demons were something we all lived with, Steve said, but no one ever talked about it. On the outside, everything was perfect. Inside, we were all just trying to survive. For Steve, this realization came much later in life, when he began to look back on his childhood and recognize the toll it took on him emotionally. Steve acknowledges that, while his father's influence shaped his life in many ways, it also shaped the man he became, the man who had to work twice as hard to understand himself and his place in the world. There's a part of me that will always be affected by how I grew up, Steve reflected. But there's also a part of me that's grateful, because without those experiences, I wouldn't be who I am today. I wouldn't have the empathy, the understanding, and the ability to navigate difficult situations that I do now. My father taught me lessons, but not in the way people think. The betrayal within the family. As Steve Ross continues to unravel the complex relationship he had with his father, he reveals a shocking truth, one that has haunted him for years. Beneath the surface of their family's wealth and success, there were betrayals, lies, and secrets that Steve had never fully come to terms with. In his revealing confession, Steve opens up about the deeper, darker elements of his father's life, things he only learned about later in life and still struggles to understand. These revelations about deceit within the family, have rocked Steve's world, forcing him to confront the painful reality of what his father truly left behind. "There were things I found out about my father that I never saw coming," Steve said, his voice heavy with emotion. "It wasn't just the business. It wasn't just about making money. It was about the people he hurt along the way, and how much he was willing to sacrifice for his own success." For years, Steve had believed that his father's ambition had been solely about building an empire, about creating something lasting. But what he didn't realize was that his father had sacrificed not just relationships, but his own moral compass in the process. Steve's admission that his father had betrayed his family in more ways than one is a shocking turn. "I found out about my father's secret affairs, the people he manipulated, and the ways he hid things from the rest of the family," Steve shared, his voice tinged with anger and sadness. "There were people in our lives that he treated like pawns in his game, and I never understood that until I grew older. He was willing to hurt anyone, even those closest to him, just to get what he wanted." Steve's revelations paint a picture of a man whose ambition was so consuming that it blinded him to the people who truly mattered. The idea that Steve's father had betrayed the family in such a personal way left him grappling with a sense of betrayal of his own. "For a long time, I didn't know if I could forgive him for what he did," Steve admitted. "It's one thing to work hard for success, but it's another to sacrifice your relationships, your integrity, just to win." The betrayal, however, wasn't just about infidelity or manipulative tactics. It was about the way Steve's father had shielded his family from the truth, hiding the darker sides of his actions in an effort to preserve the perfect image he had built. "My father was a master at controlling what people saw," Steve said, reflecting on the years he spent unaware of the extent of his father's secret life. "But I started to see through the facade, and it was harder to swallow than I expected." Despite the pain and betrayal, Steve admits that understanding his father's actions was part of his own journey of growth. "In a way, finding out the truth about my father made me who I am today," Steve shared. "It forced me to confront the reality of how I viewed success, how I viewed family, and how I viewed my own life. I had to ask myself, what am I willing to sacrifice? And the answer was nothing." The lessons Steve learned from the truth about his father's betrayals became part of his own life philosophy. "Success is important, but not at the cost of who you are and who you love," Steve said, his voice firm with conviction. But even with this newfound understanding, Steve admits that the scars of his father's actions will never fully heal. "I'll never be able to undo the damage my father caused, both to our family and to the people around him," Steve reflected. "But I can choose how I live my life now. And I choose honesty, I choose integrity, and I choose not to make the same mistakes he did." Steve Ross speaks about the price of success. In his candid confessions, Steve Ross doesn't just open up about his father's personal betrayals. He also dives deep into the larger truth of what success, power, and wealth really cost. Throughout his life, Steve had witnessed firsthand the toll that his father's single-minded drive for success had taken on their family and his own personal happiness. The legacy of power was something that his father had passed down to him, but it was also a burden that Steve now realized he would carry for the rest of his life. "My father's empire didn't just come with money, it came with expectations, and those expectations were suffocating," Steve shared. "When you grow up with someone who believes success is the ultimate measure of everything, it becomes your reality too. But I never stopped to think about what it was really costing me until much later." Steve admits that for many years, he focused solely on achieving success in his own right, driven by the belief that it was the key to happiness and fulfillment. But as he matured, he came to realize the emptiness that could come with pursuing power without balance. "The more I succeeded, the more I started to lose sight of everything else," Steve said. "I was following in my father's footsteps, chasing the same things he had: power, control, wealth, but at what cost?" Steve acknowledges that his drive for success often took precedence over his relationships, personal well-being, and happiness. "There were moments when I didn't even recognize the person I had become. The same relentless drive that had gotten me where I was had also stripped me of the things I valued the most: time with family, peace of mind, joy in what I was doing." Steve speaks about how the obsession with power can sometimes lead to an emotional disconnect from the people and experiences that matter. "Success isn't just about numbers on a bank statement or the deals you close," he said. "It's about what you have when the work is done. It's about the people you've built relationships with along the way. And that's something I lost for a long time." The years spent chasing after success without taking time to appreciate the small, meaningful moments of life left Steve questioning what kind of legacy he was creating for himself. It was in the aftermath of his father's passing and his own personal reflections that Steve began to understand the true cost of power and success. I had to ask myself, what do I really want to leave behind? What's the point of all this success if it leaves me feeling empty? He said, the weight of these realizations heavy on his shoulders. It took losing parts of myself to understand that true power isn't in what you have, it's in who you are and how you treat others along the way. Steve's perspective on success and legacy shifted dramatically, from one of ambition at all costs to a more balanced approach that valued authenticity, relationships, and personal growth. But as Steve reflects on his father's legacy, he can't help but feel a deep sense of regret for the way it shaped their lives. My father's legacy is a double-edged sword, Steve admits. He built an empire, but he also left behind a trail of people who were affected by the way he lived, and I'm one of them. While Steve acknowledges the power and influence his father's empire provided, he also understands the price it came with, the relationships that were damaged, the emotional toll that was exacted, and the weight of expectations that became impossible to meet. I want to leave behind something different, Steve said firmly. A legacy of balance, a legacy of meaning. The family heals. As Steve Ross continues to peel back the layers of his father's legacy, he opens up about the painful process of forgiveness and the emotional journey of healing. While he has struggled with his father's actions and the impact they had on his life, Steve admits that the path to understanding and reconciliation has been essential in finding peace within himself. The journey to forgive his father, and, perhaps more importantly, to forgive himself, has been one of the most transformative experiences of his life. For years, I carried around so much anger and resentment, Steve shared. It was like a weight I couldn't shake off. I wanted to blame my father for everything, the pressure, the emotional distance, the pain. But eventually, I had to realize that the only person I was hurting was myself. Steve admits that it wasn't until he began to look inward, addressing his own feelings of guilt and unresolved anger, that he was able to make peace with the past. I had to ask myself, what is holding me back from moving forward? And the answer was clear. It was my inability to forgive, not just my father, but myself. The healing process, Steve admits, wasn't easy. For a long time, he held on to the idea that forgiveness meant excusing his father's actions. But he came to understand that forgiveness wasn't about that at all. Forgiveness doesn't mean letting someone off the hook for their mistakes, Steve explained. It means releasing yourself from the chains that their actions have on your heart. You have to let go of the anger, the hurt, and the resentment if you want to move forward. Steve reveals that this shift in perspective was the key to his own healing. It wasn't about excusing my father's behavior. It was about accepting that I can't change the past, but I can choose how I react to it. In his journey to forgiveness, Steve began to rebuild his relationships with family members who had also been affected by his father's actions. There were so many wounds within our family, so many things that went unspoken for years, Steve said. But once I started healing, I saw the possibility of reconciliation, and I realized that forgiving my father was just the first step. I had to forgive myself for the things I blamed myself for. Steve's journey wasn't just about forgiving his father. It was about confronting the impact his father's choices had on his own life and accepting responsibility for his own actions. I spent too many years blaming others for my pain, but the truth is, I had to face the fact that I allowed myself to be trapped in that cycle, Steve reflected. For Steve, the journey of forgiveness and healing has been a process of rebuilding his own identity, separate from his father's legacy. I spent so much of my life trying to outrun my father's shadow, he said. But now I realize that the only way forward is to stand in my own light, to be who I am, without the weight of his legacy holding me back. Steve admits that the journey is far from over, but he now feels a sense of freedom that he never thought was possible. Forgiveness isn't a one-time thing, he explained. It's a continuous process. But once you start, you realize that the peace you find within yourself is worth the effort. Steve Ross takes control of his own legacy. With the journey of forgiveness and healing well underway, Steve Ross now looks toward the future. His past, defined by his father's towering influence, is no longer a shackle holding him back. Instead, Steve is determined to create his own legacy, one that's not defined by the shadow of his father, but by his own choices, his own vision, and his own values. The path to this new beginning has been long and fraught with challenges, but Steve's resolve is unwavering. I spent so many years living according to other people's expectations, Steve admitted. The business world, the public, my family, everyone had their own ideas of who I was supposed to be. But the moment I took control of my own life, it was like the world opened up in a way I'd never experienced before. For Steve, the decision to take charge of his own legacy wasn't just a personal victory. It was an act of reclaiming his identity. I had to stop looking at my father's empire as something I needed to conquer, Steve reflected. Instead, I started seeing it as something I could build on, something I could evolve into my own vision. One of the most significant changes in Steve's life has been his approach to his business ventures. Where once he was driven by the need to prove himself against his father's legacy, he now focuses on creating a meaningful impact in areas that align with his values. Success isn't just about profit anymore, Steve said, his voice filled with conviction. It's about making a difference, leaving a positive mark on the world. And that's something I never thought about until I realized how much I had been chasing the wrong things. Steve has shifted his focus to philanthropic ventures, investments in sustainable businesses, and initiatives that prioritize social responsibility over sheer financial gain. Growing up, I was always told that power and wealth were the ultimate goals, Steve reflected. But when I reached that point, I realized I wasn't fulfilled. I had everything I ever dreamed of, but I still felt empty. It wasn't until I focused on what really mattered that I began to feel like I was living my truth. Steve now spends his time building projects that reflect his newfound commitment to authenticity and creating a legacy of value that extends beyond money. It's not just about the next big deal. It's about the next big idea that can make a real difference, Steve said, eyes alight with passion. That's what I want to be known for. But this new path hasn't been without its challenges. Steve admits that there are moments of doubt, times when he feels the weight of his father's legacy creeping back in. There are days when I question myself, when I wonder if I'm making the right choices, Steve confessed. But those doubts don't control me anymore. I've learned that the only person I need to answer to is myself. Steve's journey to creating his own legacy has been a process of trial and error, self-discovery, and continuous evolution. But with each step forward, he feels more confident in his ability to chart his own course. The legacy I want to leave behind isn't one of wealth or power, Steve said, his voice resolute. I want to be remembered as someone who made a difference. Someone who changed lives, not just bank accounts. That's the legacy I'm building now, and it's one that's mine to own. Outro Steve Ross's journey from the shadow of his father's legacy to his own path of success and self-discovery is nothing short of inspiring. Through years of struggle, forgiveness, and personal growth, Steve has not only transformed his own life, but also redefined what it means to build a lasting legacy. Now, as he steps into a future driven by authenticity and purpose, the world can finally see the man he was always meant to be. What do you think of Steve Ross's journey to break free from his father's legacy? Do you believe that success can truly be fulfilling without authenticity? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of personal transformation and success.